very fine. So as Dudley decided, okay, I'm going to sort of gradually retire, we found another couple within our Crummell community, Don and Hilda Vest, who were prepared to sort of assume the responsibility for the press as publishers, and took over where when Dudley left, and the Crummell Center sort of, moved the press into the hands of Don and Hilda Vest. They published about 13 titles. I continued to work with them on their board. And then when they were ready to retire, they came to me and said, okay, your turn. Find a collective who will work with you and you take this on. So I've been on the board of Broadside Press for some years now as a volunteer, as someone involved in continuing the theater, continuing to mentor young poets. We had a program called Broadside Press Detroit Public Library Residence Program that put poets into our local libraries for the summer to work with children and adults, to mentor them in writing and encourage their creativity. So that's the kind of work that it's been with Broadside Press. I'm at the point now where I may be pulling away, and I've already encouraged some young writers and activists to come in and be on the board, so that eventually I also will withdraw and they will carry it on. But it's very much a treasured institution in Detroit, and most people are aware of it, know its history.
Something I'd like to get a better understanding of, partly it's emblematic in your own history and career, but it's the kind of interweaving of activism and poetry and literature. And right here in Detroit, important organizations, the Black Panthers, for example, but others probably I don't know about. And what I'm really curious to hear from you is how some of the thinking of young people in, let's say, the 60s and then the 70s and the 80s was influenced by maybe some of the poetry or some of the other resources in the literature.
Absolutely. Poetry played a phenomenal role in the Black consciousness movement. If you look at a poet like Hakeem Matabuti, who was a Detroiter, Don L. Lee was his old name, slave name we call it. His little poetry books sold for maybe $1 or $2 in the thousands. Dudley could barely keep them. He just kept doing edition after edition to try to keep up with the demand. Think Black, Don't Cry, Scream. These were all little poetry collections that came out during this period that people would buy and rehearse and learn by heart. And they were both expressions of the activism and explanations of the activism for people who weren't engaged, and manifestos and rallying calls to people who were not themselves activists but understood what was going on. So poetry played a big role. Also, the emerging Black theater played a tremendous role, and we had two of the key writers and producers, Ron Milner, who became the Black writer of that period, right here in Detroit, and Woody King, who became probably the most influential producer of Black plays and mentor of Black actors. So Detroit was really a mecca during this period of both political involvement and a kind of sort of complementary or parallel development in the arts.
And that it sounds synergistic.
Yes, absolutely, because the same people were involved in both.
And I've talked to a few people who grew up in Detroit and whose political consciousness and kind of activist consciousness was very much affected by the literature, but also, as we talked about a little earlier, the Black Consciousness Library.
Absolutely.
And
there were so many significant political activists, many important political thinkers, Grace Boggs and her husband James Boggs, Martin Glaberman and his wife Jessie Glaberman, who were part of CLR James's organization and who were involved in Correspondence, that whole publication. So we were the youngsters compared to, say, the Glabermans and the Boggses, and they were there to mentor us and to really expand our understanding of political engagement.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and Grace Boggs is still living?
Yes,
That's
into her 90s. It's wonderful, and still very much involved in mentoring young people through the summer program that her organization sponsors every year.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, so there were these layers of political activism and ideological understanding in Detroit that made it an extraordinary place, and really provided that basis for us as the Black consciousness generation to be active and to formulate strategies and to formulate ideology.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that the phrase Black consciousness is a very specific kind of political theory, or is it more of an umbrella?
I think it's more of an umbrella because it surfaced in and generated activism in so many different areas, right? And basically, it was simply an understanding that people involved in all of these different areas had, that we were in a moment of history where we could and were determined to redefine ourselves according to our own vision of ourselves and our own understanding of ourselves, and to rid ourselves of projections from the dominant group about who we were, to get rid of that.
Mm-hmm.
And we were helped in doing that as we were inspired by the struggles in third world countries to be independent, to throw off colonial rule and subjection. And we watched those struggles very closely and identified so much with them, and understood that in order to be free, we had to become involved in this philosophical and emotional decolonization, right? And one of our leading thinkers in this period, Ngugi, who's a Kenyan writer,
Mm-hmm.
coined the phrase decolonization of the mind.
Mm-hmm.
Was not just enough in the case of the third world countries to break with colonial rule, institutional rule, but also to free the way they thought about themselves and the visions they had for their future from, colonial rule. That it was a philosophical, emotional, spiritual undertaking. And I think for us here in this country, for African Americans, the Black consciousness movement was about that process.
And framing new
self-representations, framing new objectives of struggle, refusing to see ourselves only in the context of the American boundaries, right?
Mm-hmm.
Seeing ourselves as related internationally to the whole diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
So this was a very important moment of sort of breaking out, and that's what Black consciousness means for me,
Mm-hmm.
and I think for many others who were engaged at that particular moment.